Thank you very much the invitation and the possibility to speak here. I usually hear that the right, especially the conservatives, lost their social and political background in the West, and this situation is ended. And I hear the same argument when I was young and started to interested in politics and started to be active in politics nearly 15 years ago, or nearly 20 years ago. So I would reflect on the question that why the right could win. As I started to work as a political analyzer about 12 years ago, during my first week in the office, I found a small book with the title Why We Lost, Explaining the Rise and Fall of the Center-Right Parties in Central Europe from 1996 to 2002. This book was a collection of 7 country studies, including, for example, Hungary, Poland, and Lithuania. And in these countries from 1996 to 1998, right-wing parties and coalitions won several elections, and their governments were quite successful in the field of economic policies, not only macroeconomic aspects, for example, reducing inflation or unemployment, but also they were quite successful on the level of the ordinary people and the ordinary families. Economic and political reforms were completed with success on the international politics because these governments made very important and successful steps in the EU and in the NATO integration process. And despite the successful governance, by the next cycle of elections from 2000 to 2002, 6 of the 7 parties were out of power, and in several cases themselves, the right-wing parties, were collapsed. In the same time, we saw in Western Europe successful right-wing leaders, such as Aznar in Spain, or Balkenende in the Netherlands, or Berlusconi in Italy, or Chirac in France, or Schüssel in Austria, and we could complete this list with Anders Fogh Rasmussen in Denmark, whose party in the Liberal Political Alliance, but he had right-wing partners during his prime minister period, and his governments made several policies with conservative and right background. And we can also follow this line with several varieties of the right. That time we heard today about Pim Fortuyn, or we can mention here this point Jörg Haider from that period. But the most important thing that time the contrast was very strong and the question was very serious: why the right lost against mostly post-communist parties in Central and Eastern Europe after successful governance, in the time when the right had a wave, had a conjuncture in the West. 20 years after, the contrast between the previous and the contemporary political situation is also very spectacular. Those Western European parties, which dominated the political landscapes during decades, lost their majority of their electoral basis, and in the best case, they could participate in the process of governance as a smaller partner in a coalition. In the European Council, the European People's Party has only 8 prime ministers or president. It depends on the national political system that who represent his or her country, the European Council. But one of these 8 political leaders, Janez Janša from Slovenia, lost the election in April, so probably he will leave his office during the following weeks. And also the ECR has +2 prime ministers in the European Council, and Viktor Orban with the Fidesz is in the European Council without any party affiliation at European level nowadays. So the situation changed in European politics. The right-wing parties are very successful in Central and Eastern Europe, although some of them, like Boyko Borisov, as I mentioned, Janez Janša, lost during the last period. But we see very weak electoral results in Western Europe by the right-wing conservative parties. My colleagues speak a lot about the situation in the West, so I will reflect on the situation in Eastern and Central Europe. And my main question is, how did the right-wing parties and politicians in Central and Eastern Europe learn from their defeats, and what happened after 20 years when they lost the elections after successful governance? So the first important element of the answer for this question is a long political learning process. After 40 years communism, the right had to learn again how to organize and develop political communities, also political parties, which are already the central element of contemporary politics. The right had to learn how to organize modern campaigns, targeting and mobilize the voters. And the right also had to rediscover and redefine the facilities, naturally the facilities of the 21st century, the classical political questions. What is national interest? What is national sovereignty? How to organize a national community? Or what is the moral fundamental basis of the society? During this learning process, the right should facing post-communism and its benefited political interest groups. And on the other hand, the right should face globalization with its social, economic, and political consequences. And the political alternative of the right is based on the national sovereignty and the economy, which is based on labor. An economy which has strong contacts with the most competitive and the strongest transnational cooperation, but has strong and stable national entrepreneurs. And the alternative, the political alternative of the right, is based on the national heritage and the family, which are the basis of a stable and competitive society. Naturally, there are other political actors who have various political programs and goals. But the right learned again, or we can say rediscover after 4 decades illegality and around 3 decades hard competition in Central and Eastern Europe, that politics is a never-ending story. Politics is a never-ending race. Only those could represent their values and their voters who could win the elections. And only those could win who has a clear political alternative, which is based on values and real support from the voters. Only those could win who has a real electoral basis and a well-organized professional party and a strong political community. I started my lecture with the book title, Why We Lost. It's not a hoax or not a fake story, it's here. And that time the answer was quite simple. Other political actors were much stronger, especially post-communist parties, post-communist political actors in Central and Eastern Europe were stronger. If we see their politicians, the political experience, the political knowledge, or the background of their politicians, if we see their parties, the media landscape, the financial resources, the human resources, and the political messages of their parties and their politicians, we can say that they were stronger. But as I mentioned, politics is a never-ending story, and the right learned that political competition could be won by political strategy, political decisions, and political activity. Following this way, the right came back and won against post-communism, not only in Hungary, but in Poland, in the Czech Republic, in Lithuania, and several other countries in the region. The moral basis and the political knowledge to redefine political goals, reorganize political communities, has much longer traditions in Western Europe and was not destroyed for decades by a totalitarian political regime as happened in Central Europe or in Eastern Europe. Therefore, the basis for the renaissance of the right already exists in Western Europe. The quickly changing political and economic context is determining our life, and this situation is not only a possibility, but a responsibility to reflect the new situation, based on values, based on coherent political alternative and political realities. Thank you.
Menj oda is a szépen.